into applying evolution, I was able to organize a series of workshops on mismatch, to organize the topic of evolutionary mismatch and what to do about it. And these workshops, which Sood attended, he was just my a graduate student at that time, they resulted in an article that never got published in a peer-reviewed journal. And it was an article that I co-authored with two distinguished philosophers, Lisa Lloyd and Elliot Sober. And it only ended up as like a white paper on the Evolution Institute. But despite that, it was widely read and became quite influential. And then several years ago, Sood said, let's take this across the finish line and publish this as a peer review article. And that's what has come to pass with a prologue and an afterword, and that's what Sood is going to talk about. And it was thanks to Sood that we did cross the finish line, and so I'm very grateful to you, Sood, for having done that and for your contribution to the project. So with that, I think let's take it away.
All right, great. I think Erica Crispo was part of, I see her name on the participant list. She was part of the people that contributed to the mismatch workshop. So I'm glad to see you here.
That's great.
Mm-hmm. All right, so shall we begin then?
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so today's talk is based off on the paper that David talked about, recently published, Evolutionary Mismatch and How to Evaluate It. It's been published in a peer-reviewed online journal, This View of Life magazine. So we'll just get straight away right into it. So what is evolutionary mismatch? Evolutionary mismatch
are you sure? Do you want to share your screen at this point, Sood?
Oh, yes. Okay. All right. Just give me 1 second here. Okay.
Gathered from next door.
Oh, not this screen. Okay. All right. Now you see some rocks. No.
Yes.
Do you?
Yes, we see rocks. Beautiful rocks.
Okay, here we go again. Evolutionary mismatch and how to evaluate it. A paper based off on a talk based off on the paper by the same name that was recently published at the This View of Life magazine. So we'll just get right into it by looking at how does one define evolutionary mismatch. So an evolutionary mismatch is defined as a negative consequence that results from a trait that evolved in one environment being placed in another environment. A typical example of a mismatch is a trait that was an adaptation. It was a functional trait that contributed to fitness in a prior environment. But traits that are originally neutral or even deleterious can potentially acquire new harmful consequences in an altered environment. Okay, so sea turtle hatchlings burrow out of their nests on cool summer nights. They use the brightest object in the sky, the moon and the stars, to orient themselves to the beach. Moon is bright but sufficiently far away to brighten the beach and the water and illuminate the whole sky. An artificial light source appears very bright due to being very close to the observer and provides the overwhelming stimulus. Hatchlings, when they are confronted with these two alternative options, hatchlings will ignore other visual cues like the moon and the sky, which are usually part of their environment, and move toward artificial light no matter where it is relative to the sea. So this is a very clear example of a dysfunctional trait of a mismatch. So what is the solution for this? Well, should we light up a nice lighted path for the hatchling so that they walk to the beach? Should we light up the whole beach to deter turtles from laying eggs on the beach? We don't want them here. Let's just get them out of here. Or a more reasonable solution would be what's adopted on the East Coast now, a lights out mandate at night, where on summer nights, in evenings, now there is a policy, a suggestion to turn the lights off at night. So then this results in a fix. This is a fix to the mismatch. This is a solution to the mismatch, where now the moon again is the brightest object. So the turtle moves back to the sea instead of walking the other way to the urban environment. Okay, now let's look at the classic example, which is talked about in the paper. So aquatic insects like mayflies, caddisflies, and horseflies are attracted to water bodies. What exactly are these flies attracted to? Is it water? Is it the need to sit by a calm lake and contemplate life? Or maybe it's just fishing season? Well, it's none of that. These aquatic insects display what is called as a polarotactic behavior. They are responding to polarized light reflected off the surface of water. Why are the flies attracted to water in such a way? Because they lay their larvae on the surface of the water. So anything that reflects polarized light in a matter similar to a water body and within the range experienced by these flies on their evolutionary timescale will attract these flies. On such non-aquatic surfaces like solar panels or shiny cars, this leads to drastic fitness consequences. The fly lays the larva on the solar panel and the larvae die. So here you have an image of a shiny black car, and I don't know if you can see this, but it's just filled with flies in these top two images here. These are images of, on the bottom left, on the right side of the slide, bottom left, are images of larvae landing on solar panels, larvae laying eggs on the solar panels. So basically what happens, if you look at the image here on the left now, go all the way to the left of the screen where my pointer is, light reflected off a water body becomes polarized. What that means is oops. Okay, my computer glitched there for a second. Light reflected off a water body is polarized. What that means is that the waves only exist in one plane. They are either in the horizontal plane or the vertical plane. Aquatic flies have evolved to recognize this and use this as a proxy to locate large water bodies and to lay their larvae on their surfaces. So anything that mimics this polarized light will provide a super stimulus to the flies. Okay, now in the ancestral, let's look at one more example. In the ancestral environment, when humans went out to hunt game, fat was a rare resource. Wild animals have circulating levels of fat according to the season, but overall the fat was a rare resource. It was a precious resource. Can anyone guess what this image is of these cow, bovine looking animals on the top right? What are they doing? Well, they're at a salt lake. These are gores. These are a cattle-like animal found in India. They're huge, and they are at a salt lake. So salt was also a rare resource. In the bottom right is an image of the people of the native people of the Ohio Valley collecting crispy and crunchy hickory nuts. Well, what is something that provides a mouthfeel and a gastronomic and becomes a gastronomic equivalent to all of these psychological cravings? Potato chips. Something's very odd with my PowerPoint presentation. It's changing on its own. So can I stop for a second?
Sure.
Okay. So I apologize. Let me just see what's going on here.
No problem. Technology gets the best of us.
Goodness, yeah. I think I had timed my slideshow. And okay, there we go. Okay. Okay. I think we're good now. All right. So I'll share my screen again, desktop 2, share. Happened right at the punchline of the joke too, so I'm really sad. Anyway, so I was going to say, so I was going to say, what is something that is an equivalent, something that you can find in a supermarket that gives the perfect mouthfeel, contains the fat, the salt, and the crunchiness, satisfies all of these psychological evolved cravings, and is a gastronomic equivalent to all of these flavors? Well, it's a potato chip. So here we have a picture of what can only be described as a Neanderthal Eve being tempted by the spokesperson of the big snack industry. So, okay, let's use these examples that we looked at. We looked at the turtle, we looked at the aquatic flies, and then we just did a very brief example of how humans are attracted, how human psychological cravings for foods have been super stimulated in the modern environment. So let's look at these examples, but shift gears a little bit to try to formalize some of the main terms that are used when one talks about a mismatch. So we talk about the ancestral environment when we talk about mismatch. Ancestral environment, we label it as E1. Novel environment is a different change environment, and we'll call it E2. And a trait is, any measurable phenotypic trait, maybe adaptive in E1, maybe neutral in E1, it may be even deleterious in E1. But what happens is in a new environment, that trait faces a negative consequence that is related to fitness or well-being. So adaptive traits become maladaptive. Neutral traits might become maladaptive. A previously deleterious trait might acquire new deleterious features. So when a trait which evolves in one environment finds itself in a different environment, faces a negative consequence, we call that a mismatch. Now let's look at this in terms of the specific aquatic insect example that we looked at earlier. So in the case of the aquatic insects, mayflies, caddisflies, and horseflies, E1 is a very specific aspect of the environment. E1 is not simply the aquatic environment. It is very specifically the reflective body, the reflective surface of water. Okay. E2 is not just the modern urban environment. E2 is a very specific aspect of the modern environment. It is solar panels, shiny cars, asphalt, and oil slicks. And the trait here is the trait of attraction to polarized light. When this trait of attraction to polarized light finds itself in the novel environment containing solar panels, shiny cars, asphalt, and oil slicks, this results in a mismatch with very drastic consequences on fitness. Here at the bottom right, you have an image of a mayfly laying a larva on top of a car. And there, that just results straight, in death to the larva. So very drastic fitness consequences. So it's very important to define, for your mismatch case study, it's very important to define even E2, the trait, and what exactly is what exactly is the consequence of the mismatch. And I am stressing on this once again, that E1 is not simply, for this example, E1 is not simply the aquatic environment. E1 is very specifically the reflective surface of the water. E1 is defined separately for each trait that is the object of mismatch study. So if this unfortunate caddisfly, let's say in a modern urban environment, let's say it's mismatched across different traits. Let's say T1 is attraction to polarized light. T2 is some other hypothetical trait. T3 is, let's say, some other hypothetical trait. It'll be important to define E2. It will be important to define the ancestral environments separately for different traits that are being mismatched. Okay, so let's move on to, okay, here's the mismatch. What can we do about it? Well, Horvath and his colleagues, they came up with a very genius solution. What they did was they added non-reflective tape to shiny surfaces. So these are images of solar panels. They added non-reflective tapes. And what they found was that this simple solution resulted in almost like a 10 to 26-fold decrease in the attractiveness of the solar panels. So the graph here on the right, the bars are the frequency of aquatic insects being captured on different solar panels with different degree of how much reflective tape, non-reflective tape has been added to them. So A corresponds to this first set of bars here on the left, the first image here, with just one set of reflective tape on the border. So clearly that surface attracted a lot of flies. But as you add more and more reflective tape in B, in C, and in D, the frequency of how many flies are captured on these surfaces goes down. So it turns out that the machinery, the trait, the attractiveness to polarized light, the perceptual machinery of these insects have evolved to find large bodies of water. So when you break up a large surface into smaller surface, like it's depicted in image D, when you break up a large surface into smaller surface, the aquatic insect's perceptual machinery is not triggered. So they don't go to that surface. So that's why you see here in the graph, where you see n equals to 10, much fewer flies are now being captured on the surface that is depicted in image D. So there are different types of mismatch. So now we have defined E1, E2, the trait, and then how does one go about solving mismatch? Now let's look at the different types of mismatch. So the one mismatch that we just discussed earlier was mismatch that occurs on a generational, phylogenetic, temporal time scale, where we assumed that the entire population that is being studied is the species. And then every member of that population suffers from the mismatch in a modern environment. Okay, so that was the basic assumption there. Mismatch can also occur on a much more shorter, like a developmental time scale. It can occur on a spatial scale where two environments exist at the same time. And then we'll also look at an example of a cultural mismatch where also two environments, E1 and E2, exist on the same at the same time. So moving on to developmental mismatch. All right, so once again, we'll break this down into E1, E2, and trait. So one example that is often talked about when it comes to developmental mismatch is the example of humans developing in a different environment while being inside the womb, and let's say they experience a different environment much later in adult life. So in this case, E1 is defined as the early developmental environment, which is also the species' typical ancestral environment. So for example, the intrauterine environment, when a baby is just a fetus in the womb, mother's fetal environment, or it could also be defined as early years of life. A trait could be any measurable phenotypically or developmentally plastic trait that could be the object that is the object of the study. And E2 is simply just an environment experienced much later in life, but outside the range experienced by the species. When a developmentally plastic trait finds itself in an environment that is outside the range experienced by the species, you'll see a developmental mismatch. So an example for this is the Dutch famine example that is often talked about. So in the ancestral environment of humans, the amount of available food likely varied, but the pattern of spatial and temporal variation was probably such that the amount that was probably such that that experience what amount of food experienced in early life probably reliably predicted the amount of food available later in life or throughout life. This particular pattern of environmental variation resulted in a pattern of phenotypic plasticity in which the environmental cues determining the adult phenotype is experienced during an early stage of development or even before birth. So the Dutch famine is the example where during World War II, Germans imposed a famine on the Dutch that lasted for about 7 months or so. And decades later, adults who were fetuses during this period developed diet-related diseases such as obesity and hypertension at a greater rate than those that were born before or after the famine. In the case of the Dutch famine, the pattern of environmental variation in the modern environment, E2, was altered such that individuals experiencing a food-poor environment as fetuses were born into a food-rich environment. So there is a mismatch. Their metabolism was shaped in the mother's womb in a food poor environment. So metabolic adaptations to food restricted intrauterine conditions now find themselves in a food rich environment, resulting in a host of diet related diseases later in life. All right, so moving on to spatial mismatch. Here you'll have both the environment contemporaneous to each other, So you have environment E1, you have environment E2. This could occur, on a scale much smaller than a generational time scale. Imagine a forest fire or a sudden environmental catastrophe. And the example that is mentioned in the paper is we provide a example where consider again an aquatic insect that lives in heterogeneous environments. Sometimes the insects lives in ponds that have fish in them, even, and sometimes they live in ponds that don't have fish in them. When they find themselves in ponds which has fish in them, that is disastrous for them. And when they find themselves in ponds that have no fish in them, the insects thrive. Every generation, adults disperse from their natal pond and lay eggs in new ponds. These insects evolved adaptations that allow them to preferentially choose ponds without fish, but the adaptations are far from entirely reliable or perfectly reliable. As a result, in every generation, you'll have some larvae that are deposited in bodies of water with fish, and then they are decimated. So this is an example of a spatial mismatch where both E1 and E2 uh, uh, exist within the same time scale. Let's look at an example of a cultural mismatch. So we have defined mismatch pretty broad. We have defined E1, E2, and T. We can define them, very broadly. And if once you define them very broadly, you can show the utility of the definition uh, by demonstrating it to understand mismatch in a non-biological setting. So here I'd like to give an example. This example is not in the paper, but cultural mismatch is something David and I have been thinking about for a long time. So David, do let me know what you think of this example. So here we are looking at education styles or learning styles in contemporaneous cultures, E1 and E2, and we'll look at cultures that are defined as interdependent cultures containing interdependent social orientations. These are usually the so-called Eastern cultures, and cultures which have independent social orientation, Western cultures, loosely defined. And I'll get to, I understand the problems with, Eastern, Western, these very broad definitions, but I'll get to that in a bit. So just bear with me. So in Eastern cultures, holistic thinking is nurtured through educational practices that emphasize contextual understanding, relational reasoning, and collaborative learning. This environment encourages students to adapt their thinking based on social dynamics and the context of the situation. For instance, students may be taught to consider multiple perspectives and to engage in group discussions that require them to adjust their reasoning based on the contributions of their peers. So there's adaptability, and adaptability is fostered, which leads to a cognitive style that is responsive to complexities of social interactions. So a more holistic thinking style. In contrast, in Western cultures, an analytical approach to education is emphasized. Individual achievement and standardized testing, students are often required to adhere to specific frameworks and rules for problem solving, which can limit their ability to think flexibly and adaptively. The focus on individual performance can lead to cognitive styles that prioritizes linear reasoning over contextual adaptability. So imagine a child, an immigrant, first generation, spends some time schooling in an Eastern educational setup, moves to a Western nation in a Western education setup. So there you have the situation where the trait or the cognitive style of holistic thinking finds itself mismatched in E2. When immigrant children that develop holistic thinking through their upbringing enter Western educational systems that do not value or nurture this trait in the same way, this could lead to several challenges. Not get too much into the detail here, but what I wanted to go back to again was that E1 and E2 in this case, Eastern and Western, this does not have to be um, something that is geographical. So Greenfield and colleagues, it's not here in the references, but Greenfield and his colleagues found that a shift toward a capitalist mode of production in Chiapas in Mexico in recent decades led to a more independent pattern of social organization, something that one associates with a Western style of education. So this happened not only in the same country, but within the same city, same community. A capitalistic mode of production, as it was introduced, they found that a more independent pattern of social organization was seen in the society. This in turn led to more analytical cognition in the children in classrooms. Similarly, residential mobility is associated with independence. Those who have moved more often, and, and those from cultures with great levels of mobility demonstrate a more personal as opposed to collective sense of identity. And then in Japan, they showed that the settling of new frontiers, has been posited as an explanation for greater independence in Hokkaido than in the rest of Japan. So Eastern Western, education styles loosely defined, you can see the same differences within the same geographical region. And here the example is that a mode of production can lead to a more independent social orientation, leading to more analytical, causal, focusing more on individual achievement. And a holistic thinking style can find itself mismatched in such an environment. So we are going to change gears just a little bit, and I want to present to you two very complex examples which sort of break the definitions for E1, E2, and the trait T a little bit. Once again, this section is also not part of the paper. So let's look at organ transplant. So in an organ transplant, an organ from a donor is transplanted into a recipient who is often a family member or a close HLA match. Well, does this case present a good example to apply mismatch thinking? Well, there is separate environments, the donor and the recipient. There is an organ, or we can think of it in terms of organ function, which goes from one environment to another. And then there's a possibility of mismatch of the organ in the new environment if the recipient's immune system rejects the new organ, resulting in fitness and well-being related consequences for the individual. You're not thinking about populations here, you're thinking about the individual. So is it okay to call the host E1? Is it okay to call a recipient E2? What is T? Is it organ function, or is it the entire organ? Or is T the well-being of E2, the recipient, which contains this new organ? So I'm not going to provide any answers here. I just wanted to present two complicated examples to sort of test, the limits of what is E1, E2, and T, but also to point you towards thinking in terms of heuristics. That E1, E2, and T are heuristics. They are models that we create to understand mismatches, and sometimes things will not fit neatly into these boxes that we create. Okay, let's look at another really complicated example. Okay, here's an example of stem cell transplant. A stem cell transplant is a procedure in which a patient receives healthy blood-forming cells or stem cells from a donor to replace their own stem cells that have that are either cancerous or because they are cancerous have been destroyed by radiation treatment or high dose of chemotherapy. Stem cell transplant is a curative, often a curative alternative when all other types of therapies have failed, radiation and chemotherapy, for individuals that have blood cancers. So the leukemias, lymphomas, myeloma, etc. It's usually in leukemia and lymphoma. It's usually in leukemia where you get a stem cell transplant from another individual. Okay, in an allogenic stem cell transplant, the healthy stem cells may come from the blood or bone marrow of a related donor of the patient, or from an unrelated donor who is genetically similar to the patient. An allogenic stem cell transplant is most often used to treat leukemias. Okay, so here again, even E2T are very difficult to define. So in a stem cell transplant, you really want to modulate something called as graft versus host disease and graft versus tumor effect. In a stem cell transplant, it offers a curative option for blood cancers because you're able to leverage the effect of graft versus tumor effect. When you get a stem cell transplant, you basically get a brand new immune system. Your own immune system is destroyed in the bone marrow. You get a new immune system from a donor. This new immune system then, you can leverage the effects of this new immune system to find cancerous cells. Those same cancerous cells, which are these cancerous cells now are naive to this new immune system. They have no experience of this new immune system. So what becomes important here is to modulate the effect of graft versus tumor effect and graft versus host disease. You want some mismatch so that this new immune system is able to target cancer cells that are missed, let's say, by chemotherapy or radiation. But you don't want a lot of mismatch, because if there's a lot of mismatch, you'll have immediate disease and you'll have very short-term survival. So some sort of modulation is required in this case. I hope this example made sense. If not, we can come back to it at the end. Okay, so what are the different components of a well-supported mismatch model, or what are the evidentiary requirements? The first thing to do is to define the population. In the aquatic insects example, we assume that the entire population, we assume that the population is the entire species, which has been uniformly selected to be attracted to polarized reflective surfaces. But in reality, most species are divided into subpopulations experiencing different selection pressures, connected by gene flow. So identifying the relevant population for a given case of mismatch might not necessarily be straightforward. So let's take one example where it might not be straightforward. So when it comes to atherosclerosis, or plaque buildup in walls of arteries, we could postulate that plaque buildup occurs due to a specific novel component of E2, wheat lectins. These are a protein found in wheat. a specific type of wheat lectin is wheat germ agglutinin. Notice the name agglutinin. Wheat germ agglutinin has been shown in vitro studies to facilitate clumping of red blood cells, to facilitate plaque formation and the atherosclerotic process. So could it be that wheat is something, consumption of wheat is leading to a mismatch in modern human populations? And if that is the case, how do we define the ancestral human population? What is the original ancestral human population to which we are comparing the modern human population? So here I just wanted to show you this is a map of human migration out of Africa. Glitching a little bit. Okay. So when you take the example of atherosclerosis, and if modern humans are mismatched, and atherosclerosis is an example of a mismatch that results due to consumption of wheat and the specific protein in wheat called wheat lectins, then how do we define the population, the ancestral population, the population in E1? Is it the population that existed about 200,000 years ago in Africa, in East Africa? Or is it the population that started migrating out of Africa? First wave was around 120,000 years ago. I see that the website is not behaving. I'll try to make it smaller and see if that makes a difference. Or if you are someone that has Australian Aboriginal ancestry, is it the population that existed about 5,000 years ago and found its way into Africa? So is it the very first group of people that came out of Africa around 200,000 years ago? Is it the much more recent humans around 60,000 years ago? Or is it even much more recent, depending on what your genetic ancestry is? So this is again the same map that is showing this without the animation. I'm happy I have this because of a glitch on the website. So the first migration out of Africa was about 200,000 years ago. Is it this population? Is it this population that came into Europe? Is it this population that came into Australia? Or is it this population that populated the Americas? So when you look at atherosclerosis, who do we compare ourselves to, basically, is the question. And the answer might differ based off on what is your genetic ancestry. And this again is just a map of how wheat agriculture spread across the Levant region on an east-west axis. So if you're someone whose ancestry goes back to this region, your peoples probably have a very longer history on wheat-based products, 7,500 years. But if you trace your ancestry, let's say somewhere here in India, where wheat agriculture only arrived 1500 BC, that population has much shallower history on wheat-based products, suggesting a shorter amount of time for genetic adaptations, and as a result, more of a case for a mismatch like atherosclerosis. So defining the population is very important. defining the traits, the trait or the traits is very important, and sometimes also it might not be that straightforward. So here in the paper, we talk about the example of lactose tolerance. So all mammals can digest lactose from milk during infancy, but lose this ability in adulthood. Um, in humans, we see continued lactose tolerance into adulthood, and humans are very unique in that way. In humans, uh, probably the only mammal that continues to drink milk into adulthood. So in humans, lactose tolerance co-evolved with dairying practices. This is one of the cornerstone examples of gene culture coevolution. We see that as dairying practices emerged, the spread of pastoralism favored lactose tolerance into adulthood. All of this is great unless you're lactose intolerant. The ancestral trait here, the ancestral trait or the older trait is lactose intolerance. That was the norm. The ancestral trait of lactose intolerance into adulthood is still around and finds itself mismatched in the modern environment where milk is abundant. So here, the trait of lactose tolerance, there is at least 5 different uh, traits. Functionally, they are all the same. They allow an individual to digest lactose into adulthood, but at least 5 different instances of this mutation have been found, indicating convergent evolution. And this trait has evolved in different geographical regions. It has evolved in North Africa, it has evolved in the Middle East, it has evolved in East Africa, and it has evolved in Eurasia, independently of each other. So, uh, why did the same functional trait evolve 5 times? Well, different selection pressures and evolutionary causes are likely responsible here. So the phenotypic trait of milk digestion has a dual genetic history: lactose intolerant and lactose tolerant. Lactose intolerant people find themselves mismatched in a modern environment where milk is abundant. And then, furthermore, the trait of lactose tolerance itself is 5 different traits. It's 5 different genetic mutations with similar functional outcomes. The other thing, another thing important to delineate is selection pressures and fitness consequences of a trait in E1, in the ancestral environment. So in the northern latitudes of Europe, a cereal heavy diet meant that calcium intake was low from cereal grains, and UV radiation mediated vitamin D production in the body was also low. Just imagine cloudy, gloomy skies of London. In such an environment, if you're a part of a dairy farming pastoral culture and you happen to tolerate milk into adulthood, this presents an advantage. Moreover, groups of pastoral people that have more lactose tolerant individuals will over time tend to outgrow those who do not. In a different selection scenario in Middle East and Africa, milk simply acted as a clean source of water. Just imagine, the dry regions in North Africa and in the Middle East, where this trait also evolved independently of the Eurasian mutation. So a different selection scenario might be likely reason for the evolution of this trait in a different geographical region of Middle East and North Africa. Milk acted as a clean source of water, simply prevented people from dying from people that were able to digest lactose into adulthood. It were, able to use milk as a source of water. Moreover, shifting focus from thinking in terms of individuals, if you look at groups or populations, a shift from keeping cattle for meat to producing dairy has immense economic benefits. Dairying produces 5 times as much calories per acre. So here you can imagine how cultural group selection might come into play. Groups uh, that started keeping cattle for dairying uh, had just much more caloric energy at their disposal than those groups that were keeping cattle just for meat production. So delineating selection pressures and fitness consequences of a trait in E1 is equally as important as defining what the population is or what the trait is. So here is just that same table, and I just wanted to show you how these 3 different mutations that evolved in different regions of Eurasia, Middle East, and East Africa have been estimated to have a different origin in terms of time. The Middle Eastern mutation is much more recent than the Eurasian and the East African. And the environments that these mutations evolved in are also different when you compare Eurasia to Middle East. The next step involves integrating ultimate and proximate explanations for the study of trait in the ancestral environment in relation to E1. So here's, you're asking the basic how and why questions. And I wanted to do that by taking a very Socratic questioning approach. So why are insects attracted to solar panels and cars, one might ask, when you're looking at the aquatic examples? Well, solar panels are much more recent than insects, so the attraction is clearly much older. So then that might lead you to ask, what exists in the natural environment of an aquatic insect, which looks like solar panels, and might explain this attraction? What are these insects doing on the solar panel, you might ask? We saw that they're actually laying their larvae. That might lead you to think there must be something in common about light reflected off a water body and the solar panels. So these are the sort of questions you might ask if you're taking a mismatch-based perspective and you're trying to integrate the how and why proximate and ultimate questions to study the trait in E1. So eventually it ends up looking like this, integrating ultimate and proximate explanations. So the proximate explanation, the how, leads you towards the mechanism and development-based answer. The how in the aquatic insect example is the attraction to the polarized light. How is it that the insect is laying an egg on a solar panel? It is an attraction to the polarized light. Well, why does this trait exist over any other trait that could have existed? Well, aquatic insects have used polarized light reflecting off the surface of water body as a proxy for locating larva-laying surfaces. So when I showed you that earlier slide with the solution towards this mismatch where they used non-reflective tape, Horvath and colleagues who designed this solution integrated both the proximate and the ultimate explanation when they designed when they figured out, we could just put a non-reflective tape which breaks up a shiny surface into smaller surface and just makes it less appealing to a aquatic insect, because the aquatic insect is looking for large bodies of water, and the reflective tape, the non-reflective tape, breaks up surface into smaller surfaces, making it less appealing. All right, let's look at another thing that is that you could study when looking at a mismatch. So just as you look at selection pressures and fitness consequences of T in E1, you should also look at selection pressures and fitness consequences of T in the novel environment in E2. So here we'll look at why do humans and increasingly children require corrective lenses. And here it is necessary to identify the very specific relevant aspects of E2 that cause the detriment. So a vertebrate eye is a complex adaptation, a product of gene by environment interaction. Eyes develop very reliably because the elements of environment involved in the gene by environment interaction are also reliably present. If these previously reliable elements of the ancestral environment change, then even perfect, so-called perfect adaptations such as eye that have become species typical can turn maladaptive. Look at me wearing glasses. In the case of vision, eye development has taken place outdoors with a wide range of focal distances for generations, for eons. In modern human populations, large proportion of time spent indoors focusing at short distances has resulted in an epidemic of vision-based disorders requiring glasses. So let's just focus some more time on this example. And we are looking specifically at selection pressures and consequences of T in E2. So a normal eye adapts to distant and close objects by changing the length
Mm. Oh, it's coming back. Okay.
Is anybody else?
I think he might have lost connection for just a minute. We'll see if he's able to rejoin.
Okay.
I think Sid might have lost connection. I'll see if he's able to come back.
There he is. He just came
Oh.
back.
Perfect.
Soon you're muted soon.
my internet dropped and I had to shift to the hotspot on my phone. I'm happy I'm able to do this real quickly. Okay.
And also, we want to have some time for questions. So I just wondered how much more is their presentation, and what can we do so we can leave time for questions?
We are wrapping up. So I'll probably take 5 more minutes.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Perfect.
You don't see the screen yet, do you?
Not yet.
Okay, you
Looks
see it
good.
now?
Yep.
All right. Okay, thank you for being patient. Okay, so a normal eye adapts to closely placed objects and distant objects, but when you are exposed to an environment, think of young kids holding their cell phones very close to the eye sort of adapts permanently to it. And that results in a myopic eye that is elongated. It's too long, basically, because you grow up holding phones too close to your eyes. And then, if your eye is too long, images of distant objects are going to fall short of the retina, resulting in a requirement for corrective lenses. So what are the aspects of E2? Is it reading? Is it really reading and holding mobile phones at short distances, or is it diet? There are some counterindications here for the reading hypothesis. So here again, you're specifically defining E2 to the trait of myopia. Labrador retrievers get myopia, but E2 reading doesn't apply to them clearly, but they do eat refined foods like modern humans do. There are examples of urbanized illiterate populations with a very high prevalence of myopia. So there's no reading, but they still have myopia. Conversely, there is examples of non-urbanized ethnic groups who, despite an 8-hour school day, have a very low prevalence. So what is going on here? Well, one hypothesis is that it is high glycemic foods, refined carbohydrates, that cause insulin resistance. Over time, that leads to hyperinsulinemia. And as this chart is showing, this could cause unregulated tissue growth, which has a direct impact on scleral growth in your eye, which facilitates the eye elongation. And probably that coupled with reading at close distance facilitates this modern chronic disease. And here I just wanted to give you a quick example of what the actual problem is here. Here the problem is high glycemic foods. And I wanted to show you this graph real quick before we wrap up. So high glycemic foods are simply those foods that lead to a very sharp glucose spike followed by a very sharp insulin spike. Humans have been eating seeds for a long time. The oldest evidence of seed eating goes back to about 32,000 years ago. Humans were grinding seeds 32,000 years ago. But what is new, what is E2 in this example, is machine-based milling and grinding, machine-based flouring, so to speak. So these two graphs here at the bottom, let's just focus on this one here on the left. It shows you the glycemic response to rotis, very common in Southeast Asia and in the Caribbean. Glycemic response to rotis that are made from industrially milled flour, that is the blue line, and rotis made from stone ground flour. You'll see that there is a much higher glycemic response, much closer to the normal, glucose response in the rotis that are made from industrially milled flour. Rotis that are made from stone ground flour have a lower glycemic response. And the top two images are just microscopic images of, on the left, industrially milled flour, and on the right, where you have larger grains of stone ground flour. So there is a list of desirable types of evidence that we present in the paper, that you must define the trait or the traits that is suffering from mismatch in E2. Some evidence of traits inheritance, define even, define E2, provide evidence that the trait existed in even, offer some evidence that the trait was adaptive, neutral, or deleterious in even. If it was adaptive, then some link to fitness should be provided. Some evidence for selective mechanisms must be provided. And then one must show solid evidence that T is dysfunctional in E2. And then what can we, the next step obviously is then what can we do about that dysfunction? And I will stop there. And thank you for being patient despite the couple of technological glitches. So let's open it up for thoughts, comments, questions. Juliet, David, how do you usually run this part of the conversation?
Sure. If anyone has a question, you can raise your virtual hand using the reactions on the bottom, or you can use the chat if you'd prefer.
Yeah, I think that I'll just make a couple of reflections on this. Thank you so much, Sud. As we say in the paper, something that's striking is that some examples of mismatch are really obvious, like the turtles and the insects. Is just like they're very convincing, and others become super complicated, like impaired vision. We know that it exists, and so we know that some kind of mismatch is taking place, but the actual causes can be very difficult to unravel. You know, is it spending time outdoors? Is it close focus reading? Is it diet? You just will never know until you actually do the work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just the way it is. And in the paper we say, when this gets complicated, consider the alternative. Consider that you were just faced with some problem like atherosclerosis or impaired vision, and you weren't thinking about it in an evolutionary way at all. You know, how would that problem be for you? And it would be even more complicated. So I think that this evolutionary lens, even when it results in a very complicated story with many unknowns, it provides a guide for navigating that terrain, which you wouldn't have if you didn't have an evolutionary perspective. That's one of the take-home points that we made in the paper.
Mm-hmm. I have a couple of things that I can speak towards, but I wanted to just give a pause for people to ask questions or comments.
What do some other people have thoughts on?
Mm-hmm.
Susan
has her hand up.
That was really marvelous. Thank you. Fascinating. And my question for you is, what consideration might there be for artificial selection? And I'm thinking specifically domestic animals, dogs. I'm a applied animal behaviorist, so I work with dogs that are mismatched to, the homes that they're in because of the ancestral environment for the traits that were selected aren't matching, E2, which is, the apartment in New York City that a border collie might find itself in. And I wonder how and if that fits or not. And they also wondered about the nature of the flexibility of the E2 environment. So if the E2 environment is more flexible and can accommodate maybe not every individual, but some of them, or can in some way accommodate these these traits, does that make it not a candidate for the mismatch? I'm not sure how that might fit.
Yeah, so mismatches are everywhere with climate change and our us living in hyper urbanized environments. So you'll find them everywhere. But that's not to say that they continue to persist. Mismatches are ameliorated in numerous ways. The most simplest example is just by natural selection. Given enough time, a mismatch might be ameliorated by natural selection. But you could also have instances where there is actual behavioral corrections, like humans inventing eyeglasses to correct for the myopia. So that's an example of what someone like a Laland or Brown or Smee would call an example of correcting for mismatch through niche construction. And humans are the best, besides termites, humans are the best niche constructors on the planet. So there is numerous ways by, developmental plasticity, niche construction, further natural selection. All of these ways are just different ways through which a mismatch might be corrected. And it just becomes important. What is it about the dog's well-being that one is concerned about? Is it diet? Is it satisfying their play behavior? And so you might just want to specifically define each aspect of that E2, of that novel environment for the dog, and see, is it okay to give them hard foods? Like I think about that for my cat. Is it really okay for the cat to give hard foods, or should we switch to wet foods? Or should she just be eating straight up mice? So when it comes to play, what kind of play is appropriate for them? So yeah, I think all of those questions become important.
I think the dog example is great, and when we factor in with your example of cultural mismatch, Sue, I think that was a great example, and we could also add individual learning as an evolutionary process. Any evolutionary process results in mismatch, and mismatch is not aberrant at all. It's just what always takes place in changing environments. And so when we factor in individual learning, then we have many other examples of mismatch in which individuals that, basically they've adapted in any way at all to situation X, and now they're thrust into situation Y. Well, they're mismatched. And at this point, I think mismatch becomes so pervasive that we want to ask the question, are we saying anything new? And I think we are. I mean, I think this is a very disciplined way to go about studying people being maladjusted to their, even though, I mean, that's so common that we had to have been thinking about it in some way. It's not new in that sense, but I do think that this is a disciplined way of thinking about it that's, I think, very, very useful. It takes us beyond however we were thinking about it before.
Yeah, I think so too. And that's why I stressed so much when it came to that example of aquatic insects. There, for them, E1 is not simply the aquatic environment. We are being very specific in the paper. E1 is specifically the reflective surfaces of water bodies. So it's not simply enough saying E1 is the aquatic environment. For a good case of mismatch, you need to identify that aspect of E1 that relates to T that you are studying, instead of just saying, because if you don't, then that leads to a lot of hand waving and a lot of thinking where you just say, oh, humans have this psychological adaptations because they evolved in the savannah. And that leads us down, very poor science. There's another hand up, Vivek.
I was thinking like this is a very excellent lens to view in, especially in my field, evolutionary, landscape ecology, where we could see there is huge increase in human-animal conflict, especially between farmers and farming community and elephants or monkeys. This problem is hugely prevalent in Southeast Asian and African countries, and India also. Um, Here is also the same problem. Like as Green Revolution progressed, sugary and fatty crops are cultivated in the forest edges. So that causes wild population to migrate from forest to the uh, very energy-rich food resource available in the
Yeah.
forest margins. So what is now happening in the forest is a bigger question, and it is I couldn't see even one single paper addressing this in the landscape ecology field, discussing about what is happening to the flora in the forest, or monkeys stopped eating the fruits in the forest, and most majority of the population of the monkeys are on the forest edges,
Mm-hmm.
getting fed by the tourist population. So
Mm-hmm.
what is happening to the floral diversity in the forest? After all, monkeys are dispersers. They disperse the seeds.
Mm-hmm.
If they are shifting from one diet to the other diet, what is happening to the biodiversity in the forest
Mm-hmm.
when the dispersers are missing? So this is an
Yeah, that's a great
excellent
point.
lens.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, mismatches are everywhere, and the cascading effects. I think that's a good example of a cascading um, effect throughout the whole ecosystem.
Yeah.
There's one complication you didn't mention, Sood. At least I don't think you did. So let me just list it. We tend to think that there's E1 and E2 and then some trait that remains constant. But if a trait is a product of a gene-environment interaction, and most traits are, then when we go from E1 to E2, that's changing the gene-environment interaction, and the trait can be different. So the trait is not stable or not necessarily stable. So that's an additional complication. And I think we listed atherosclerosis as an example that in some environments, ancestral hunter-gatherer environments, nobody has it.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't exist as a trait. And so in the modern environment, you're getting the novel environment leads to novel gene-environment interactions, and that results in a novel trait. So the stability of T in a standard mismatch story is something which sometimes in some cases needs to be questioned. It's that complicated.
Yeah, yeah, and you'll also see where in hunter-gatherer populations there is plaque formation, but they don't drop dead because of heart attacks. So it might seem that plaque formation occurs, but there is no stroke or there is no heart attack like you see in Western populations. Um, um, One animal that does not get plaque in their arteries uh, are seed eaters, like rodents and pigeons. They don't get plaque formation because they have evolved on a seed eating diet. But then there are specific aspects of wheat, like the one that we looked at, wheat lectins and specifically wheat germ agglutinin, which in lab studies has shown to lead to clumping of platelets.
Sud, how can we distinguish there's one thing to say, well, it's wheat and it's particular agglutinin, but it's really a quantitative measure at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got seed eaters, you've got generalists and specialists in diets, and generalists, which is what we are, and always and have been for more, for a long, long time. And so one of the arguments is that what we're doing that's not natural is not eating unnatural foods, but eating a very narrowed, we've turned into specialists.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of an interesting difference, because we need the trait that we have that deals with it somewhat. But when it's the only thing going, and we can't, and also we don't think about the lack of other traits. I mean, the lack of other foods. So it's that balance of maybe unused abilities that are going awry because we're not eating the foods that call for those abilities. Whereas we're overloading a system that's supposed to deal with some of this. And that's kind of a real, I mean, it's making it even more complex, although it may be easier to solve because you just sort of shotgun say, well, let's have more diversity in your diet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the way I see it, the problem is not cereal grains, but it's the eating the same kind of cereal grains 3 times a day, 7 days a week, till the day you die, and that happens with wheat. So you have the same set of wheat proteins that are leaking through your intestine. There is an immune response being built to it. So you're seeing the same sort of proteins that are leaking through your gut, leading to a situation of an autoimmune response. But if you have a varied cereal grain-based diet that includes millets and barley, in addition to wheat, then maybe, and some of these other grains they don't have gluten or as much gluten in them. And they used to be very commonly eaten across India, but in urban environments, they're very difficult to bake. Like, I don't know if anyone has tried to bake with barley or millet flour. It's not easy to bake with barley and millet, much easier to bake with wheat.
I have one, but might be the last question, although anyone else is welcome to ask more. Are there any examples of a mismatch hypothesis that made perfectly good sense? I mean, it was logically a good hypothesis, but then ended up being just not the case. So ended up being rejected. I kind of have in mind the paleo diet, but any examples of something which could have been true but turned out not to be?
Wow, that's a good one. I cannot think of anything in particular off the top of my head, but I'm just thinking of all the hand wavy epipsych kind of hypotheses. Like, but yeah, I can't. I guess you would have to think along those routes to come up with an example that was simply just not true.
All right. All right. Okay. All right. Well, are we done? Anyone have a final question? Vivek, do you have another question?
Yeah, just before the discussion happened about decreasing dietary diversity in humans, right? We have the same problem in food systems also. The soil needs different crop cycles. I mean, we are cultivating monoculture. So even the agriculture system needs the soil, it needs its dietary diversity like humans. So here comes the One Health problem. So if you are going to think this in a One Health aspect, giving the dietary diversity as the solution for soil and humans arrives at a single solution, that is overall health in the ecosystem and planetary health also. So
That's
we
a
are going to
wonderful,
address both of them.
that's a wonderful point to make, Vivek. So soil health is just like human health this way, is I think what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's wonderful.
That's what makes the difference between chocolates that aren't so good for you, apparently, and those which are. The heavy metal business for chocolate, cadmium in particular, I think,
Oh,
is depends on where it grows.
yeah. Okay. So very holistic. All right, friends. That was great. And it's been recorded. And so thank you so much, Sue.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.